This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop. And the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies. And fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Sup?
Sup, dude. And tonight, we're going to talk about animation, specifically TV animation. Let's start right from the beginning. So, the first animated TV show was Crusader Rabbit, which was a tiny little segment that was basically, at least the first original TV animation show. It was shown on some kids show apparently back in, I believe it was 52, somewhere around there.
It was really early.
Yeah, it was really early.
Yeah.
This was, of course, when television was really small. Like a TV screen was only bigger than your cell phone screen, basically, and was in black and white. And TV wasn't very impressive, but people had never had like TV in their home before, so they were really crazy about it. Yeah. Also, at the time, there was actually lots of animation, but it was almost all old stuff left over from the movie serial period.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if our audience is aware of this, but for about 20, somewhere between 20 and 30 years, movies basically were a block of primetime television that was basically just shown over and over for a week and then swapped out for a new block of primetime TV. What basically happened is that a movie block would be maybe about 6 hours long. It would include two movies, an A movie and a B movie, which is where the term B movie comes from. And then there would also be a newsreel, some comedy shorts, and cartoons.
Yeah.
And so that's where all our old Warner Brothers, Fleischers, Disney cartoons come from, is they were actually meant to be part of this block that was distributed to movie theaters all across the nation every week. And so when TV came along, it wasn't long before they grabbed all those cartoons from those blocks and created all sorts of new shows using basically recycled material.
Yeah, pretty much.
And so that was kind of where TV animation started, as recycled material from the previous era, which is not entirely a surprise, plus a little bit of new stuff such as Crusader Rabbit, and then later we'd have the Huckleberry Hound show.
Yeah.
Now, was Huckleberry Hound specifically created for TV, or did those already exist for movies prior to that?
Huckleberry Hound is for TV.
Oh, okay. It was for TV. Okay.
Yeah, I think, just to rewind a little bit.
Okay, sorry, I'm maybe going too fast.
No, that's okay, because this is one of the problems you run into, because both of us are huge, like, cartoon fans. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of hard to figure out where to start, just in case somebody listening hasn't heard of some of this stuff. Mm-hmm. Because I keep doing that, because I keep forgetting I'm old. Mm-hmm. The idea that when TV started, they needed something to put on it. What people don't realize nowadays is that TV wasn't 24/7.
Right. Yes, it wasn't. It was scheduled and limited.
Yeah. Because you had, like, I think there was, like, 4 networks.
Yes, and there's actually, you're right. There were, I believe, there were 4. And but there's a catch to that. There's a reason there's 4. When radio first came around, they didn't regulate radio, and everybody and their brother started a radio station. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is actually kind of an interesting story. Literally, everybody, their brother, their sister, and cousin started a radio station. And so it was a huge explosion. This was in the 1920s. So when TV came around, the very first thing that happened is the big radio networks, they might sound familiar, the NBC, ABC, CBS, I think MBC was the other one, the Mutual Broadcasting Corporation or something. I think that's the fourth one.
Yeah, but I think they went by, wasn't that the DuMont Network?
Yeah, you're right. I think it was. Anyway, so what happened is the very first thing that when TV started to proliferate is they rushed to Congress, all these big networks, and said, there's going to be a huge explosion. It's going to be uncontrolled. It's going to be crazy. Dogs and cats living together, chaos, all that kind of thing. And so they said, what you should do? You should put a freeze on new TV stations for a couple years while you sort this stuff out. And Congress, in their wisdom, said, something, big networks, you're right. Now, of course, at this point, the big networks already had stations in all the major cities. So as soon as the freeze came down, what happened is that it basically blocked any new people or new independents from coming in for several years. By the time they relaxed the rules, guess what? The networks had already established themselves and independents had a hell of a time getting in and getting started. This is why there are only 4 networks. Well, 3. Well, whatever. We'll get to that later. But
that kind of changes every now and then.
It changes every now and then, but for a long time there were only 3. And then
4.
Well, 4. There were 4.
There was the DuMont for a little while anyway.
I was going to say but for most of our lifetime there was only 3.
Yeah.
Because I think DuMont died somewhere in the 60s. I think maybe even the 50s. And then so we had the 70s and 80s and 90s until Fox came around. There were only the 3.
Yeah.
And that was the result of manipulation on the part of the big networks. But anyway, so that's just a complete side note as to why we only have these few networks. They're all from radio too.
And that does kind of tie in with stuff that'll come up later on. So that's good to know. And then with these networks, what they would do is they only broadcast, I think the first few, it was only like 10 hours a day that there was anything on them.
Yes. Oh, less than that when they very first started. You can find old TV listings online. They would have things like, we're going to show this thing at 8 o'clock for half an hour, and then at 10 o'clock, we're going to show this for half an hour. And in between, it's just static.
Yeah.
There were long periods of just static. Yep.
Yeah, because when we were kids, we had that. And this is, again, something I don't think anyone under 30 would understand, was that networks would go off the air.
Yeah.
And you'd get the test pattern and the...
Yep. I remember those.
And it was usually around 1 in the morning, and then they'd kick up again, usually around 6 or 7.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Usually whenever they started the morning news or morning shows or whatever.
Yeah. And then what ended up happening was, as the network started spreading out and claiming more air time, because again, the more time I'm showing stuff, the more time I can sell ads and actually make some money. They ended up moving into the weekends.
Right.
And you'd have the weekend programming is usually a little different. And this is where you get a lot of kids shows. Right. And they were, I believe the last time we were discussing this, we used the only example I think anybody, again, 30 or under would understand is Krusty the Clown. Right. Yeah. From The Simpsons. That you had a lot of that where it would be skits and a comedy bit or they usually played a character. Yep. And then one of the things they do to fill time is they would show cartoons, and again, like you were saying, it was usually the ones that years earlier had been shown at the theaters as part of the whole big theater going experience.
It almost always was, because what had happened is the big studios were offering those old theater cartoons as part of packages, basically. They weren't buying 1 or 2 of them. They were buying like a few hundred of these cartoons. And then it's like, okay, well, where do we put them? What do we do with them?
Yeah, and they were. It's the same thing. Any of our long-term listeners, when we talked about the '60s with the Monster Kids, that the old monster movies were repackaged as the creature feature and sold to TV. Yep, it's kind of the same idea.
Yep, exactly. Because that was Shock Theater.
Ah, yeah,
that was the Shock Theater package.
Yep.
The first one, I believe there was 2. Okay, anyway, so back to cartoons.
Okay. And it's the same idea. You started at a certain point, people would experiment with doing new things for TV. But for animation, you had the problem, it was expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. And slow.
Yeah, because what they did at the time, most animation for the theaters was what they called full animation.
Right.
Which is where if I'm drawing the character, every time they move, like if they move their arm, I'm redrawing the entire character.
Mm-hmm. And
again, that makes a lot of more work for the animators.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. What you'd mentioned Crusader Rabbit.
Yes.
And we were talking about this before because I'd always thought that it was Rough and Ready from Hanna-Barbera that was like the first new TV show.
Mm-hmm.
But Crusader Rabbit, it was earlier, like we were discussing, like you brought up.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting to see it because it's not exactly animated.
1949. I just double checked. Well, it is and it isn't. It's like it's almost what we would call motion comics today, right?
Oh, not even.
Not even, really?
Like, holy smokes, it's yeah, what was it? There was a term that one of the old animators back in the day, illustrated radio.
Oh, okay.
Was what Chuck Jones used to call it. Because if
right.
you ever see it, a lot of it would be like a static picture and a voiceover.
Really?
Yeah, and then they might have something like, and then Bob showed up. And it would be like literally just a picture of Bob that you see kind of like hovering into frame sort of thing.
Right, right.
Like it was very, 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 very low key.
Mm-hmm.
I guess would be the word.
Right.
And then what it was, and there's a few shows like this that came from around that time that used a lot of it. I've seen a few. There was like Gerald McBoing Boing.
Yep.
Is one people might know because they remade it not too long ago. I remember when it was Luno, which is about this boy with this magic talking horse, and they go on like barely moving adventures.
Right.
And then what ended up happening is Hanna-Barbera were the guys that kind of perfected what they called limited animation.
Mm-hmm.
Which is the idea that if the character moves his arm, you have one drawing of the character without an arm, and then you just animate the moving arm part.
Right, yeah, as needed, yeah.
And that kind of, once they got the hang of that, that kind of made it more feasible to do TV stuff, because it looked better, it gave the illusion of full motion, and it was cheap enough that you could make a couple of bucks doing it.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then they started it, you'd mentioned... Huckleberry Hound was, as I recall, the second show that they had done. And it was just crazy popular.
Which I never understood. I was never really a big Huckleberry Hound fan. They were okay, but... I mean, not that I saw them during their original run, but I saw...
Yeah.
Even then, I was probably watching either a later remake of it, or I don't know if I was watching the original episodes, but either way, yeah, Huckleberry Hound, never my thing.
Yeah, you were... We watched like the originals and new because they'd repackage them every few years.
Sounds right.
Yeah, and this is a thing that kind of goes with what you were saying before too. The thing is, it was entertaining for the people at the time, not because their IQs were a lot lower than ours now, but because it was novel. It was like new. people, and it was a lot of the jokes. Like if you see a lot of the old Hanna-Barbera stuff, it seems kind of hokey. But at the time, those jokes were new. And the problem we have, like even watching, say, Huckleberry Hound, we were watching it as a kid 20 years later.
More than 20 years. But yes, yeah.
Yeah. And that formula had been used and reused and recycled. So even when we watched the original, it just felt like all this other same old generic crap we've been watching all our lives.
Because we'd been watching 1,000 derivatives of it already.
Yeah, mostly from Hanna-Barbera themselves.
Right, that's true. That's very true.
Yeah, that'll become another running theme in this show, actually.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. And the interesting bit with this, too, is most of these shows were shown in what we would consider prime time.
Yeah, that's something I think most people don't realize. The sheer amount of... That there's almost always been primetime cartoons. Like, almost always, right from the beginning. It's been very rare that there wasn't some primetime cartoons, but they were never dominant. They were never the main form. I mean, there's always, like... Essentially, the best way to think of it is there's always been a Simpsons. It's been under different names. It's been different shows. Sometimes it's called the Flintstones, but it's sometimes it's called the Jetsons. Sometimes it's called Wait Till Your Father Gets Home, and that's a reference. I'm sure that's like many of our audience are going, "What? What's he talking about?" But we'll get to that later.
I can do you one better. Sometimes it's called the Barkleys.
Ooh.
Sometimes it's called the Roman Holidays.
Okay, you got me on that one. The Roman Holidays. That one I don't know.
Yeah, there were almost as many Flintstone ripoffs as there are Scooby-Doo ripoffs.
Well, because Flintstones was super, ultra, mega popular.
Yes, it was.
And so as an end result, because it was so damn popular, everyone ripped it off. Duh.
Mostly Hanna-Barbera.
Well, yeah. For recaptured. I mean, if you can sell one show... Well, again, is it any different, though, than what goes on now? I mean, with...
oh, hell, not at all.
I mean, the studios that produced Family Guys produced, 3 or 4 shows. They keep ripping themselves off. They just...
Yeah, basically.
They just change the color and designs of the cast and basically make a new version of Family Guy. Call it something else.
Yeah. Yeah, and then that goes to the TV thing, too, is that formula has been around since, ironically enough, the Honeymooners.
Yes, it has.
Like, it's the Honeymooners plus kids.
Basically. Well, I think we might mention on another show, maybe we didn't, that the Honeymooners itself was, the Flintstones itself was supposed to be a Honeymooners animated series, but they couldn't get the rights. So they just said, okay, they're cavemen, and we'll change them just enough that the Honeymooners can't sue us. And there we go. There's the Flintstones.
Yep. And then it's one of those interesting things because I remember a friend of ours had talked about entertainment in general, where he said you can't really expect big dramatic changes. Everything happens in baby steps.
That's true. And
it reminds me of that because, again, the Flintstones was the Honeymooners, but then they added kids. And then that's sort of the formula that so many of our sitcoms afterwards followed.
That's true.
And I think that got into the lexicon, I guess, because the Flintstones was just impossibly popular.
It was. Still is in some ways.
Yeah, like it's still in rerun. And they keep doing like new stuff. For better or worse sometimes.
Yep, that's true. But yeah, usually for worse. It's like Scooby-Doo. There was one original show that was super mega popular and was awesome, and then ever since then they've just been doing like crap copies of it. They keep doing crap remakes again and again and again.
Well, it depends, because they've done some, I'd say last, 5 years. They've done some Scooby-Doos that were actually good shows.
Really? Which ones were actually good?
I liked Mystery Inc.
Okay. Yeah, I did hear that one wasn't bad, yeah.
They did the intro. What they did to change it up a little is it's a continuing story. And it's the origin of the team.
Right.
But the extra twist they added to that is you find out that, like, Fred and Velma and the gang weren't the first team.
That's an interesting twist.
That there was another one, and their mascot was Professor Pericles, who was this like super intelligent bird.
Okay.
Who you find out is he's like Hannibal Lecter. He's totally evil and insane, and they have him locked up.
Okay.
Because at one point in the series, they have to go. They figure out that there was this other team that for some reason nobody talks about, and they find out about him, and they have to get him like released from prison to help them track down what happened to the other team, and he's like always screwing with them, and yeah, it's actually a pretty good show. Because they also did the trick with that too that mixed it up is they added the new things to the formula, like the Hannibal Lecter character, that there's any mystery show since Silence of the Lambs has the evil turncoat guy. Like, that's popular. And then they played on the fact that most of the people watching probably know who Scooby-Doo and the gang are. So they played on you already knowing this stuff. And then did all these weird little twists in that it was things that's kind of always been there but you never thought of.
Huh. Okay.
And then they got into, like, say, everybody's family. Because you're like, well, they've got parents. Where the hell are their parents?
Who let them go wandering across the countryside in a van.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, exactly. But they addressed that, and you meet their families, and you find out more about what's going on there. And it was interesting because again, it didn't really contradict anything. So that one was pretty good.
Sounds it.
But there's been so many ones that just weren't.
Okay. All right, so we better get back on track. Yeah, and there were many that weren't. Yeah.
Well, yeah, we're probably going to be coming back to this in about 20 minutes.
So that was the 50s, basically. So what?
Yeah, 50s going into the 60s.
So what happened in the 60s that was a big revolution in TV animation?
The big thing that happened in the 60s was Saturday morning.
Saturday morning? What's special about Saturday morning?
And the sad thing is anybody listening who's like 30 or under is probably saying that exact same thing.
Ooh.
And I just died a little inside thinking about that.
Well, anyway.
But what happened was they had they started moving into the weekends. So they had the Saturday morning block that they were putting shows in, and a lot of it was the Krusty the Clown kind of stuff. But what they started doing was adding more new content to Saturday morning.
Why?
And, well, because they knew that you had all these kids that were watching TV, and mom and dad were probably sleeping and couldn't complain about what you were showing to the kids. And that was a big thing because it became an advertising point. That they realized all these kids are in one spot. We can sell them stupid kid stuff. Yeah, do that.
It became a perfect captive advertising audience.
Yeah. And then again, too, it became like a dumping ground for some of the shows that came in the previous decade that would now be shown Saturday morning. So you had the filler. They were still showing some of the old, movie stuff. Like your Bugs Bunnies. Felix the Cat was another one that was popular at the time. Tom and Jerry.
Right.
And then they started having new stuff creep in. And that was, like I say, that started Saturday morning as kind of this refuge for TV cartoons.
Well, they need to fill that space with something, right? And kids were watching, so why not?
Yeah, and to that end, it took them a little while to figure out, wait, we can sell them stuff.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And it also led to weird things, because I know, again, another thing we've talked about before, everybody makes a big stink over the Flintstones. They did ads where, like, Fred and Barney are hawking cigarettes.
Yep.
And, again, you got to remember when that show first came out, it wasn't considered a kid show. It was a regular show. And those were ads like they did for any other show where the characters would, like, stop in the middle of the action. And sometimes when I'm being shot at by extraterrestrials, I enjoy a good smooth vodka. Blah,
right,
blah, blah.
Exactly.
And then, yeah, those kind of disappeared once it got moved to prime, like from prime time to Saturday morning. And then to us, it seems strange to see those old ads.
Right.
Because we remember stuff like the Flintstones as after school or Saturday morning cartoons, which was always classically considered kid stuff.
That's true. I've often wondered about that, whether we'll call it kidification of animation that occurred is mostly the result of that. It's mostly the result of, like, the Saturday morning approach. I mean, because people at one point did view animation as just a general medium.
Yeah.
And then at some point things shifted to it's not a general medium anymore, it's just kid stuff. Even though, as we just mentioned earlier, there's always been adult, well, no, I don't want to say adult, general audience cartoons, or for a more mature audience, like the Flintstones, for example. Or the Simpsons nowadays. There's always been there, but in general, people are like, animation equals children. At least they were.
Right.
Things are shifting now, mostly thanks to the Japanese stuff and other things. But for a very long time, and I'm wondering if that's partly the result of Saturday morning.
I think you're right, but there's an extra little twist that comes up in like the mid 60s.
Oh, what is it?
Well, okay. TV cartoons had their Fred Wortham.
They did.
And I know we've mentioned that the 54 Senate subcommittee hearing on juvenile delinquency,
which basically turned comics into a children's art form at that point.
Yep.
Because you weren't allowed to show anything that was... Basically, it forced the comics companies... That's another whole episode. But it forced the comics companies to basically start self-censorship, and suddenly you weren't allowed to commit crimes anymore in comics, and taking over the world is not a crime, and you can't have real criminals in comics, so now supervillains are now silly, etc., which completely wrecks comic books for like a generation or two.
Yep, and it also does the idea, because these hearings were done... under the guise of juvenile delinquency, that's another thing that made that big connection between comic book and kid. That it wasn't a moral panic, this will cause adults to turn to communism. It was, this stuff is corrupting the children. Dun, dun. Yeah, like, you don't generally see too many arguments about nowadays about, and when the kids are watching all this pornography that's being aimed at them, then because everybody knows it's not.
Right, yeah. That's true.
But, and again, that was what comic books were until those hearings when it became, everything was in context to kids.
That's true.
And that happened in the 60s because as Saturday morning got popular, they added stuff. A big thing that got added that ties into this point was the superheroes. That your Marvel and DC characters, Marvel was just starting to get big as a comic book company, and their products were insanely popular. So they made semi-animated shows based on them with theme songs that'll stick in your head for 100 years.
Very limited animation, but yes, that's true.
The DC guys started doing some, and you had other companies that were doing like superheroes. That's where you got like Super President and stuff like that. Hanna-Barbera did all kinds. They did Space Ghost. They did The Impossibles. There was... And at that time, you had the TV cartoons Fred Wortham show up, and that was Tipper Gore and the Action for Children's Television.
When did that happen? What year?
That was, I don't know the exact year. It was mid-60s. I want to say 65, but I'm not 100% on that. But it was around that time.
Wait, are you telling me that Tipper Gore tried to ruin both animation and music?
Yes, she does. She comes back every few years with like wanting to step on everything fun.
Oh my god, she's like Sauron, except she's just like she's the evil monster that keeps coming back every couple of years in the 20th century to try to ruin everything that's fun in the world.
Oh my god, now you sound like Rush Limbaugh.
Okay, anyway, yeah, sorry.
The reason for that joke, if anybody doesn't get it, is she's Al Gore's wife. People don't realize that.
Well, whenever Al Gore would rise up politically, she would come with him. She's kind of a package deal.
Yeah, basically. But your comment explains the attraction, because Al Gore isn't the most vibrant human on Earth.
That's true.
Anyway.
Well, as soon as he manages to get up there, she just steps in front of him and takes over.
Well, with some of this, yeah. And then that was the big thing that the ACT did, is they complained about the violence. And they complained about the advertising.
Okay.
Because, again, they realized that you've got kids who are basically unsupervised, that you can sell them all kinds of stuff that's horrible for them, even though it's really fun. And as a result of the ACT, you had all kinds of new rules that were put in place for what was considered kids' shows. Right. And as a side effect, that's when you also got this idea of prime time as being like more grown-up TV.
Right, yeah.
Because and again, I think what happened, it was like we said with Fred Wortham, that this put cartoons squarely as kid stuff. Because that was how it was framed off.
Okay, so yes, in the 1970s, that's what prevented children's television from just being toy commercials, basically.
Yep.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. But it also kind of ghettoized cartoons at the same time.
Yeah, and it prevented other stuff, because it's like, if anybody remembers the old Super Friends cartoon.
Yeah, of course.
Nobody hit anybody.
Yeah, they weren't allowed to.
Yeah, you kind of have to like just outwit the bad guy, and then he'd see the error of his ways, and that would be like, really?
Yeah, exactly. That's what the only cool episode of that entire series that I remember as a kid anyway was the one with Gentleman Jim Ghost.
Oh, okay.
Because that's the catch, right? He was turning everyone into like evil ghost spirits, but the thing is that they could actually get away with. He was a villain that was actually doing something. And I remember that as a kid because he actually kind of scared me because he was actually like, oh my God, this villain's actually competent. And he's actually like accomplishing his goals and he's winning. And these Super Friend ghosts are all kind of creepy and oh my God. And so Gentleman Jim Ghost was the only Super Friends episode I actually really remember well because it was the only one that was actually effective because he was doing something.
Right.
Anyway, sorry, that's my rant.
See that?
Okay, Super Friends rant over.
Oh no, because that ties in great too. Because part of the thing was the rules that basically got handed down by the U.S. government over the ACT protests was there were a lot of limits put on the ads you could sell, and shows that tied directly into a product were generally considered ads. There was the big thing you couldn't put what could be considered imitative behavior in. So you couldn't have like Batman punch a villain because kids could do that, but you could have a villain turn Batman into an evil ghost because that's not something kids could copy.
Exactly.
And then the third thing that happened that explains a lot of anybody our age, our childhoods, was there was a moratorium put on that you had to have during the kids' times a certain percentage of educational TV.
The theory being that it would force the cartoons to actually be educational.
Yeah. And that was why you'd get stuff like, again, the Super Friends cartoon for the commercial breaks. You'd have arts and crafts. You'd have, like, Wonder Woman saying, oh, if you see a strange dog, let him smell you first so he can decide if he wants to bite you or not.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was, that counted towards the educational bit. And then the other thing that did, a lot of people our age will remember, was you'd get the little breaks between shows like Schoolhouse Rock.
Yep, that's what those were for.
Yep, and that was to meet this educational like time for your shows.
Right. That makes sense.
And then at that point, Saturday morning was pretty much kidified.
Yeah, basically. I thought it would had to be. It had no choice.
Yeah.
Okay. There's why TV animation for a very long time kind of sucked. At least in our childhoods it did. Anyway.
Some of it did, and it explains why, because I think somebody young watching, like, say, the shows we watched as a kid, it would just probably boggle their mind, and a lot of it being this educational stuff. It would be like, why are the Brady kids talking to Abraham Lincoln? How did that happen? Well, because they could say, no, it's educational, it's history.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And that's why you'd get those strange episodes, like these weird pseudo-historical things.
Well, yeah, because they had to constantly work in something that they could claim was educational.
Yeah.
And so that kind of sort of almost ghettoized and ruined Saturday morning.
Yeah, it did. There were exceptions, because there were people who were willing to kind of push things a little bit. But part of the problem, too, is because TV animation had to be inexpensive. You couldn't do a lot of flash.
Right, that's true.
So you couldn't catch people's attention like with your awesome effects.
No, because it was super simple. Again, remember, a lot of TV animation from the period is only a step above motion comics at this point.
Yeah.
And you'd think, well, okay, so they can just use really nice art. No, they didn't have time for really nice art either.
Oh, hell no. And this is also why, if you look going into the 70s, the Saturday morning shows had a lot of live action. And that was because, again, live action was actually easier and kind of, in some cases, cheaper to do.
It's basically just cheap filler.
Yeah, and that was kind of the idea. Like I say, if you want an example of kind of somebody trying hard, I always use the Star Trek animated series, which came out as a Saturday morning show.
Good example, yeah.
Yeah, and you can look at, because it's Filmation, so the animation is cheap. They recycle a lot. They kind of make do fairly well with what they got. Because the Filmation doctrine was that you were only allowed a certain... it was a number of frames. Basically, a certain number of minutes of new footage in episode.
Everything else had to be recycled, yeah.
Yeah, and that's why, like, some people might remember going into the 80s, like, He-Man was Filmation. And that's why when He-Man would run, it was always the exact same shot of He-Man running.
Exactly, always.
Yeah, and that's why, because you were only allowed, like, an extra 5 minutes an episode of new film.
Exactly.
Yeah. But if you watch the Star Trek one, the people who wrote it, a lot of them were the people who wrote the original show. They were. And a lot of the episodes, there's a bunch that were episodes that they wanted to do for the regular show or were sequels to episodes from the regular show. So you had this fairly highbrow conceptual stuff with the decent writing with super cheap animation.
Yeah, piss poor animation.
I don't know if I'd quite say piss poor, because again, I've seen stuff that was worse. But it was super cheap.
Yeah, it was.
And that was another reason, if anybody's seen it, you're probably familiar with the eyeball shots.
The eyeball shots? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, like somebody say, Spock, we're all going to die. And it'd be like this ultra close-up of Spock.
Oh, right.
Basically just... And he'd raise an eyebrow. Well, it's because they're using the same footage, but they're zooming in to make it look like new footage.
Yeah, they used all sorts of tricks to do that. Because, again, it's expensive.
Yeah. Yep.
And
then in the 70s... What you had happen,
right?
The next big thing was...
the next big thing was... Are you talking about the shift where they got rid of those rules and allowed basically cartoons to get turned into toy commercials?
Nope, that wasn't.
That was that's what I thought. That was the 80s. So what was the 70s thing that we're looking for?
Because this ties into that really well in a few years. In the 70s, you had... Because a lot of the studios had kind of gotten the hang of doing TV animation. Right. And you had the first run syndicated shows, which was, at this point, you had network affiliates, and you had like your UHF channels.
Oh, right, yep. Oh, right, of course.
The syndicated
Now
stations.
I understand what you're talking about. Yes, okay, yeah.
Yeah. And for people who don't realize... TV history. Like we were saying, there were originally, I'll say 3.5 networks.
Right, yeah.
And one of the things that happened was technology advanced to the point they could add a second dial to your TV. So you had more frequencies that you could use, and that was your lower band stations, your UHF, which was your double digits, essentially. And those were bought by smaller companies. They were usually local. So Channel 20 here was like WXON.
Yeah. All the smaller independent stations. Yep.
But that frequency, Channel 20, in Alberta would be a totally different station because it was owned by someone totally different. And these guys had space to fill. And what you started getting was a before school and an after school block of cartoons. And you had companies, because the companies were taking off. Saturday morning was a big hit. In the 50s, the primetime stuff was a big hit. They thought, well, we can do this again. And they started doing new shows for those blocks.
Right.
And that was the next big step, where now you had cartoons that happened all week. Again, not in prime time.
It was just after school and early mornings.
Yeah, because it was still considered kids stuff, so you were putting it in times where kids were going to see it.
Well, this was the point, where the FCC loosened up, and they basically said, your independent stations can exist. And of course, these independent stations suddenly needed content to fill, and old cartoons were cheap, and kids watched them, so suddenly that's what they basically were flooded with at this point.
Yeah, well, they did that. They did new ones, and one of the other things that had caught on towards the end of the 60s that you started to see more in the weekday slots was they would bring some British and a lot of Japanese shows over. And they'd redub them because at this time, international rights for TV were kind of like a strange mythical beast. So you could go to say, Japan, pick up a TV show like that's where Speed Racer, Kimba the White Lion. Go back a little bit, you had like 8-Man, Gigantor. You could buy these for really cheap because the Japanese already made the money on them. You'd chop the hell out of them, dub in some silly voices, probably featuring Billy Joe Watt, because she did like everything. And then you would have more of this like cheap filler. And I think there was something about they could get around some of the restrictions with it, too, because it wasn't a domestic show.
I guess so. Kinda.
There was something, I don't remember. It was something small. But it was one of the reasons why you would see, like, from the late 60s, early 70s period, in the Super Friends, Batman can't punch out the Joker. But in the opening to Speed Racer, he runs a guy off the road, the guy's car explodes, and he's dead. That there was some kind of catch why you could get away with that in the import stuff, but not so much the American stuff. And even then, you had to edit it, because the after-school spot in the 70s, one of the most popular shows ever, was Battle of the Planets.
Yes, it was.
Which was Gotcha Man, chopped up into little pieces. It's one of the very first cartoons I actually remember watching from my childhood.
I saw it at a friend's house one day, and it blew my mind. And that was the first cartoon I remember going out of my way to find and watch, ever. It's like, oh my God, what is this? I have to watch more.
Yeah, because it was nothing like our stuff. It was
completely different and completely awesome.
Mm-hmm. And then the irony is years later finding out that in Japan, it was another one of these like primetime general audience shows. And then you realize just how much they chopped it up to get it on American television. Yeah, they chopped it up a lot. It was sliced and diced. There's an episode that only has, I think, 5 minutes of footage from the original episode.
Because for one reason or another, they just couldn't use the rest of the footage, often for censorship purposes.
Yep. There was censorship, and the other thing that happened was the Japanese did their shows, like especially their cartoons, as a continuing story. So every season had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and all the episodes ran in order. But we didn't do that here.
Right, you're right. We didn't, did we? We wanted them episodic so they could be shown in any order at any time. Didn't matter.
Yeah, and the episode that gets chopped the most from Battle of the Planets, if I remember correctly, it's the one where you find out, 40-year-old spoiler alert, by the way, that Red Impulse is actually
Mark's father.
Mark. Yeah. And it was because the problem when you did that is that splits the story. If you leave that idea in, because then later on when he sees them or thinks of them, it changes that context. And then as I recall, it was like super violent, and they had like a big like aircraft fight scene where in typical Japanese fashion, it wasn't just a puff of light and then the guy parachutes out. They would show the screaming guy burning to death that's the good cockpit. Stuff. Yeah, basically. But there was a lot, like when you get to the 70s, there was a lot of the Japanese stuff that was being brought over as this film.
Well, because it's cheap.
Yeah, and as a kid, it was exciting because, like I said, we'd send Ed up to screw around with the antenna. And you'd find a station broadcasting from some other city because none of the affiliates were... They bought their own packages. And you would find a station that was showing something you'd never seen before. A big one here, too, was we had two French stations that showed a lot of Japanese stuff.
Yeah, the French love the Japanese stuff.
Yep, and a Spanish station. Because when I was a kid, I got to see stuff like Ribon, and a few years later, the original versions of Voltron. And what the hell was the show with the guy? He's like dressed all in white, wraps his head up, drives a white motorcycle.
Oh, Moonlight Mask.
Yeah, that was on all the time for some reason in Spanish. So
in Spanish doesn't matter.
And yeah, it was just because it was cheap and plentiful. Hanna-Barbera started doing stuff in that time too, because it was I think it was packages in the Funtastic World of Hanna-Barbera, where every day of the week that slot featured a different show. And they did a bunch. Like, this was the era where the Scooby-Doo ripoffs flew fast and furious. and part of it was because they needed to... That was what they'd fill that slot with.
And I suppose... sorry, continue, sorry. I was going to say, we should probably touch on that, how Scooby-Doo also kind of broke Saturday morning.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to put it.
Because literally there was a time when almost everything on Saturday morning was 4 kids and a mascot going places and solving problems of one kind or another. Usually mysteries, but not always. I mean, and that was the template that everything was crammed into.
Yeah. There's a catch to that.
What's the catch?
Because I was going through and thinking on this. Scooby-Doo came out in like, I want to say 67, which by the time I saw it as a kid, I didn't realize it was already half a decade old. But Scooby-Doo came out, and it was a little different, because if anybody's seen the original, it was drawn, the colors were a little more muted, heavier lines. They were kind of making an attempt in like a kid kind of way to be creepy. And that, I think, was part of it. It was that group dynamic, because you had like that set up the team, and that every team of plucky teenagers after would be forever. Because they put the trick that, again, 50-year-old spoiler alert, that the ghost was always, it's Farmer Flanagan. I'm scaring you off my field because the oil company wanted it, blah, blah. Nobody was actually committing like a real
they were allowed
crime.
to, right? So.
Yep. But it felt like that, and it felt like because you take it's like a ghost. It's that guy's spooky, and then no, it's just the farmer, and the cops haul him away, and there's actually
that makes
a cop
sense. And I never thought about that. How trying to scare kids off your land is not a crime, so that's why they could get around the rules and show it.
Yeah, and it's not like little Billy's going to dress up like a ghost pirate and rob the bank.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep, and because of that, it had, I don't want to say edge, but it had a little more bite to it than the other stuff that was being shown at the time. So that's why
we probably... it's interesting how we tuned into whatever had edge as a kid. That's what we tended to remember.
Yep, and we were discussing that before in like the Pokemon episode. That and it's because like you don't want to watch something that nothing happens. Unless you're a Twilight fan. Ooh, burn! Okay. But... and there goes
our Twilight fan,
one Twilight fan in the audience. But anyway, you want something that it's you're gonna be, what the hell's gonna happen now? And even as a kid's show, you don't want it to be sanitary, because it doesn't have to be like Game of Thrones, but you want a little bit of an edge.
You do, exactly.
And Scooby-Doo did that. And then what ended up happening, Scooby-Doo isn't exactly the formula that everybody ripped off.
Oh?
There's two, because Hanna-Barbera, a couple years later, because Scooby-Doo was so popular, ripped themselves off, but did it in a way that's just different enough. I think it starts a new branch in the family tree.
Oh, okay.
And that show was...
Actually, I don't know. What show was it, Don?
You're going to slap yourself. That was Josie and the Pussycats.
Oh! Okay, yeah, you're right. I just stopped myself. You're right, it is.
Because they're basically Scooby and the gang.
Right.
They even have the cat. I forget the Alexandra's cat. I forget his name, but he's kind of the Scooby role. Mm-hmm. It's the same formula. But what they changed a little bit was, they weren't hunting down crooks that were perpetrating mysteries. Mm-hmm. They were basically fighting James Bond villains.
Yes.
But they were doing it in exactly the same way as Scooby and the gang.
With music.
And that was... Because Scooby-Doo, the original, did that you'd have these contemporary pop songs that would play during the chase scene. Mm-hmm. So when they did Josie and the Pussycats, they put the focus on that, that they were a band, and for no apparent reason every episode, they would just stop and play a gig.
And I'm presuming that they also sold records, LPs, 45s, whatever, of those songs.
They did one LP, and because I believe that and I might be wrong, that the singer was Cheryl Ladd.
Right.
From Charlie's Angels.
Really?
A few years after that. Yeah, I think she was in the band. I think she was the singer.
Wow, okay. I didn't know that.
Not 100% sure. Mm-hmm. But I'm pretty sure that, that was one of her first gigs. And then that became... The two of them are almost the same formula. Mm-hmm. But you would see, when the 100 million ripoffs came out,
right,
you would see... They all look alike. Because, again, on the surface, they're all exactly the same.
Well, they are the same, basically, yeah.
But you would get like something like Goober and the Ghost Chasers.
Right, yeah.
Which is definitely Scooby-Doo.
Right.
And then you'd get Jabberjaw, which is definitely Josie and the Pussycats.
Interesting. I'd never realized that there was actually those two kind of parallel lines running next to each other.
Yeah, because over the years, what you'll see happens is everybody, the gang being a band, is part of that formula now.
Right.
That you see when you see parodies and that, they're always like a band, but that was sort of this parallel formula until you ended up getting like the Funky Phantom.
Okay.
Where it was a ghost that chased James Bond villains with a team of plucky kids and a cat in a car.
Right.
Because there were a lot of them where like the car was after Speedbug, which was again Josie and the Pussycats with a car. You had a run of shows that there was a sentient vehicle, which is kind of creepy.
Yep.
That was part of the team.
I remember those. Yep.
Yeah, and it's all sort of from the same Scooby branch of the family tree, but they kind of go a little different ways sometimes.
Right.
And sometimes they don't, and it's like, wow, this is just a total ripoff.
All right, so we should get moving on to the 80s. The big event that occurred at the beginning of the 80s was, of course, that the rules that had been in place for most of the 70s that prevented cartoons from being just toy commercials were relaxed.
Yeah,
and
because of Ronald Reagan.
And so this started what would be the best term, Don? Tsunami? Flood? Because suddenly all the animation companies went to the toy companies and said, we can make a show that's basically a half-hour toy commercial. And the toy company said, really? And so this is the era of G.I. Joe, the Transformers, and
there's
pretty much anything that was a toy was also a TV show at one point. Almost everything.
Yeah. There's a couple of steps before that.
Oh, okay. Let's go back then.
And this is again where it starts getting a little odd. Because the thing that kind of sets all this off that nobody realized set it all off was the Micronauts comic.
Okay, that I truly did not know. Explain, please.
Okay, what happened was the Micronauts were a series of toys. They were Microman from Japan that Mego got the rights to do here. They changed the story a bit. They changed some of the toys up, and then they sold them here as the Micronauts. There was a couple guys at Marvel Comics that the one guy's son had got a bunch of these, and they thought they were awesome. They said, this would make a great comic. So they dickered back and forth with Mego, and they got the rights to do a comic book based on the toys. Now, what's interesting to note is this is kind of the first of the modern version of the Toy Story reciprocity. So the comic doesn't really follow the toys exactly.
No, it doesn't.
No, it's got its own story. It borrows a lot of the imagery, some of the ideas, but it's definitely its own story. Mego only came up with a very threadbare story for the toys. Because that, again, when toys came out, it was assumed the kids will come up with their own story. Mego, to unify it, came up with just this very basic one that Marvel took, fleshed it out. They're very different, the toys and the comic, and both are very different from the Japanese version. And what ended up happening was that got to be super mega popular. When you got to the early 80s, there was like a wave of militarism. If you remember, that was like Rambo and like Rambo 2, where he comes back and retroactively wins the Vietnam War and stuff. Hasbro said, well, we've been sitting on G.I. Joe for a while. Let's bring him back. And they went to Marvel and they said, do what you did with the Micronauts for G.I. Joe. And Larry Hama ended up being the guy in charge. And it's funny because the impression that I get was that nobody else wanted to touch him. That they were like, oh no, I'm too busy writing Spider-Man to sully my work with materialism of crass quality like this. And then Hama got it, and because nobody cared, nobody paid attention, he fleshed it out. He, as I understand, came up with most of the characters. He came up with the idea, because Hasbro just said, here's what they're going to be. Here's the toys. and he came up with the story, and he came up with that idea of putting a backstory to the figure. And he did all of it's G.I. Joe, the 80s real American hero G.I. Joe is basically him.
Yeah.
And it was because nobody wanted to bother him because they all thought, well, whatever, just some stupid thing.
Right, yeah.
That was going on. Those two things, most of the G.I. Joe thing happens. The standards for children's television are relaxed. You can now do toy tie-ins, and they said, well, let's do a G.I. Joe show. Now, what was happening at the time, and this is one of my eternal regrets, that we here in North America, we never quite became Japan.
Okay, I have similar regrets, but probably connected to different things. Mine involve mostly cat girls. But okay, sure, what's yours?
It was the idea that when you look at Japan in the 80s, their animation took off because they worked really cheap. Yeah. And a lot of people hired out, even our companies here hired out to Japan. Yep. They got a lot of work. They got really good in a hurry. And they started experimenting because they had this big market, and they did stuff that it's not a kid's show. They did stuff that it's science fiction with like beautiful animation that we spent money on and stuff. And they screwed around with stories and making good solid shows. We were kind of hitting that point about the time the G.I. Joe cartoon happened. Right. And it's because if you look, some of the shows that I think about, which were some of my favorites, would be the 80s Galaxy High. Yep. There was Mighty Orbots.
Yeah, I was going to say Mighty Orbots,
you get something like Adventures of the Galaxy Rangers.
Yeah, oh yeah.
These were shows that they were sinking money into. They were written just to be a show.
Yes.
Like, the show came first. And when you watch...
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Which was an exception at this point because people were mostly just backing toy commercials at that point. So to do an original show was actually quite a risk. Yep.
And it was happening less often.
Yep, exactly.
And that was one of the things I was reading about the Adventures of the Galaxy Rangers was really popular. Right. But the audience skewed too high. So it was basically, I think it was 14 to 25. Yeah. Loved the show.
Yeah, they did.
And that was too high for the toy company, so they couldn't get a company on board to make the toys. Yep. And that was why the show didn't get renewed.
Sounds right.
Even though it was really popular. And you had the G.I. Joe cartoon, I think, is significant because it was the first Marvel Sunbow production. Right. And it was cheap. And as the Marvel Sunbow Unholy Godless Alliance progressed, they realized you could make stuff really cheap and kids will still watch it.
Yes, they did. And they produced a lot of stuff.
Oh, they did. Nostalgia aside, if you watch the 80s Transformers cartoon, yeah, they're almost unwatchable.
Some of them, yeah. Okay, yeah, they are.
Most of them are, and their plots are baffling.
Right.
When you start getting to their third tier stuff, like Bigfoot and the monster trucks, it's why am I doing this?
I remember that. Yep. Gem and the Holograms.
Well, Gem and the Holograms is different though.
Oh, why?
It was one of the ones that, from what I understand, because I had a friend who was really into cartoons, and she told me because this is one of the shows when she was young she loved. Right. And it was because when they did the toys, I get the impression they didn't have a real clear-cut story. It was, okay, you guys do it for the show. Right. It was this just dumbass girly show that, as I recall it, I don't know if it was its own thing or if it was one of those combo shows. I think it was a combo show at something else. And they were kind of left alone, and I guess they put a story into it. So even though it's cheap-ass animation and barely written, it has a progressive story, because I know at one point one of the characters gets married.
Right? Really?
That it actually had, and a lot of people who watched it, which I didn't because it didn't have robots hitting
exactly,
anything.
Me too.
Yeah, but they loved it because it was essentially a kid's soap opera.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that was why it was so popular, even though it's sort of a footnote in most histories of animation. And to me, that's kind of a shame because that gets us a little closer to the kind of things the Japanese were starting to do.
Right.
And it all gets squashed because, again, everything becomes super cheap toy ads.
Right. Yeah, that's true. They were. Well, toys were where the money was, and so therefore that's where you got to go.
Yeah, and that's the shame because then nobody did anything original.
Yeah. Well, toys, and also remember there were other tie-ins as well. Just like we mentioned the Brady Kids earlier, there was a Gary Coleman show. Any kid that became popular on a primetime sitcom got their own show. That was the other thing that they did as filler.
Well, there's two versions because there's a 70s and an 80s version.
Right? Oh.
Because
let me guess. The 70s version, they solve mysteries. The 80s version, they hang around with a magical pal and they just have wacky adventures.
And learn lessons.
Okay, yep, that's it.
Well, no, what ends up happening is in the 80s you had anything that was popular that they thought they could squeeze a few more bucks out of, they would do. So, you had the Gary Coleman show. There was like a Punky Brewster cartoon.
Right.
I don't even want to get into like the nightmare that was the Smurfs.
Right.
In the 70s, they did this weird thing where they took something that was popular for adults and did a kid version. So Evel Knievel was popular, so they did Devlin.
Yes. There was also a Muhammad Ali cartoon. I remember watching it as a kid.
Yep. There was weird ones, too, because that was where the Planet of the Apes cartoon comes from.
Yeah, that's true.
There's another one like that too. That it was like
there wasn't a Logan's Run cartoon, was there?
No, there wasn't.
Okay,
but there was something like that. There was like I can't remember now. It's bugging me. It's right there. It was another one of these like adult like movies that they then
turned around and made into a kids cartoon, sort of.
Yeah, and you're like, that's an interesting choice.
But they did it anyway.
Yeah, they did that in the 80s and going into the 90s too, but again, it was stuff that they thought you could sell toys of.
Right. So
G.I. Joe took off, so of course you had to do a Saturday morning Rambo cartoon.
Yes, of course. A bloodless, a bloodless, actionless, violentless Rambo cartoon. Yes, okay.
Yep. And then they did stuff like when you get to like the end of the 80s, early 90s. One of my all-time favorites was, again, part of that unholy Marvel Sunbow thing, was the RoboCop cartoon.
Yes. I remember that thing. Well, they had a Marvel Sunbow adventure hour or something that they basically just filled. RoboCop was part of it. That's not what it was called. I don't remember exactly what it was called, but basically that's what it amounted to. And they just showed random Sunbow cartoons during that slot, mostly RoboCop, plus Bigfoot and the Monster Machines, plus whatever else they were going to manage to slam in.
Yeah, I think it was Robotics.
Yes, they showed Robotics. Yeah, you're right. They did.
Yeah.
RoboCop and Robotics.
There were a bunch of those Sunbow ones that they came and went. There couldn't have been more than, say, 20 minutes of footage for these things. So
Yeah, I remember. But the thing is, and this was the annoying thing, every now and then they would show something else. Like, for example, the very first X-Men cartoon was shown as part of that Marvel Sunbow Adventure Hour.
Oh, what was that?
Pride of the X-Men, yeah. They showed it as part of that. So what they do is they'd slip in other Sunbow stuff, usually pilots like Pride of the X-Men, every now and then.
Yeah.
So you had to keep an eye on the damn show even if you didn't like it, because every now and then something actually interesting or cool would pop up in that spot.
Yeah, they started doing that a lot towards the end of the 80s.
That was mid-late 80s at that point, yeah.
Yeah, because that gets heading towards... Oh my god, I'm just remembering so many of them that were like, why? But there was because Rankin Bass did one, the comic strip.
Right.
Oh, that was just yikes.
Oh, I remember that thing. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, there was four. I remember it because that was another one that changed, or it became something else because they started showing Ulysses 31 in English.
Right.
And I thought, this is an interesting combination. Ulysses 31, Rainbow Bright, and the Street Frogs. That's wow. Okay.
Well, they're just kind of randomly tossing stuff together, right?
Yeah, pretty much. But they were doing that because what was happening towards the end of the 80s was TV cartoons were dying.
Right, yeah.
And I think part of what killed them was, just nobody was doing anything new.
Right.
Like, you had kind of a heyday in the early 70s. Mm-hmm. You had a heyday in, like, the mid-80s, and then towards the mid-80s it was starting to peter off.
Yes, it was. And then the company that really revived it, I'd say, was Fox.
Yeah,
Fox.
I have to
Fox
agree.
came in. They decided they wanted to take over Saturday morning, and so they dumped a bunch of money into producing new things. Like, really, the two I guess that really start things off are Batman the Animated Series and the X-Men animated series. I mean, which both became must-watch shows for pretty much everyone back in the very early 90s.
Right.
And to the point where they even showed them in prime time for a little while. But they were ultimately still meant to be either after school or Saturday morning stuff. Because Fox was moving in, and they really, for better or for worse, helped revitalize things. Because Batman, I'm sure, was made with toys in mind. I mean, Batman was a popular character at that time already.
Yeah.
And they were coming off the Batman craze of the first Batman movie, the one with Michael Keaton. But it was still a bit of a risk. And the X-Men one was still a bit of a risk. Oh, and this is also where Power Rangers came out during this period too. Let's see, Tiny Toon Adventures.
Yeah. Well, Tiny Toon was a little earlier.
Okay.
This would be Animaniacs.
Oh, did Animaniacs come before Tiny Toon?
No, Tiny Toons was a little bit before Batman.
Right.
And then Animaniacs was a little bit after Batman.
Contemporary with after. Because Batman ran for like... Yeah. If you count both series, because there's actually two in there, it ran for like 6-7 years.
Yeah, it was on a lot.
Yeah.
But it was popular, and again, I think part of that too was they weren't limiting themselves to tying into the movies or the comics or that. They were doing a show to do a show that just happened to have Batman.
Exactly. And they were obviously Batman fans. The people, was it Paul Dini and I'm trying to remember the other...
Bruce Timm.
Yeah, I can't believe I forgot Bruce Timm. They were true comic lovers. That's something of an understatement. And so they absolutely loved their comic books. And so as an end result, they put their passion into that series. And all the series, the Superman animated series and the Justice League one and everything that followed. I know, Superman's a little dull, but...
The Adventures of Super Cube.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Well, that starts. You get the boost because at what ended up happening. You mentioned Power Rangers. A lot of the networks on Saturday were starting to go live action again.
Yes, there was that trend.
Because that was what was that stupid wacky teen comedy? Saved by the Bell.
Yeah, that was also on NBC, which was quite popular.
Yeah, and it was again because live action was easier and cheaper and blah blah blah.
Right.
Fox brought it back with Batman and the Tiny Toons and the Animaniacs. You had other networks that kind of came back for a bit because WB did a Saturday morning block.
Right.
And it was another one. It wasn't real cheap. They sunk a couple of bucks into it.
Right, yeah.
For the most part. Because what ended up happening, I think, and this is why I grown like the Justice League and all that later. Batman was super popular, but it was cheap animation.
It was, yeah, that's true. Looking back on it, it was.
But the guys doing it, especially Bruce Timm, they knew it, so they stylized it up.
Right.
So even though the actual animation was cheap, it looked pretty good. They would actually set scenes in that. But what happened, especially with the superhero stuff, especially the DC stuff,
right,
was that became the formula.
Right.
And everybody, especially DC, they always copied Bruce Timm's style if it wasn't him doing it. And his style is very simple. That was my complaint, was that every female character looks the same but with a wig.
Oh, they made it worse for the second Batman series. The Gotham Knights one, that's when they super stylized everyone, super simplified them all. That was much worse.
But it was that idea, it was cheap, and as a friend of ours once said, the beauty about Bruce Timm's style was he condensed everything down to its essence so much that no studio in Korea could fuck it up.
Ooh.
Like,
Yeah.
you remember him saying that.
I do, actually. I do. And that's true.
And it is. It's very true. But when you started going on, cheap became the buzzword for superhero stuff.
It did.
And even when you got to like the 90s X-Men cartoon, it was terrible.
Yes, it was. Sorry, fans, and I'm sure there's many of our listeners loved it, but sorry, it was terrible.
Yeah, unless you got the Japanese opening.
Yeah, that's true. The Japanese opening is awesome.
But yeah, because the show, it was cheap, and they did the thing, and this is where it went back to what happened in the 80s, that they were trying to cram all the popular characters into all the popular stories.
Yes. But using the current team and not actually allowing real evolution to happen, if you'll pardon the pun.
Yeah, and that's... And it harkened to that idea as marketing.
Exactly.
So, and I think that was, again, you started having... You could already see that there was kind of conflict between the people doing animation and the studio, like the networks.
Yep, exactly.
Because it all went cheap. There were a couple shows I remember they did in the 90s, Sonic the Hedgehog.
Right.
And there was the weekday one, which is like a wacky kids show. And the weekend one, which was this brutal post-apocalypse nightmare.
Yeah, that's true. I think it wasn't the weekday one. I think the weekend one was actually like a Japanese one, wasn't it? That they were bringing over, and then the weekday one was an American one. Is that how it went?
No, it was the weekend one was an American one. I don't remember who did it, but it was American. Right. And
but
you could tell.
Why would you have two of them on at the same time, though? That's so weird.
I've never, in all my years of looking into that, I've never found out exactly why. But I have a sneaking suspicion it's because they wanted to play both ends of the field.
Right.
That superhero shows were popular, so they wanted something like that. Mm-hmm. And the wacky kid stuff was popular, and they wanted something like that.
Right. I could see that.
I think it was different companies, too, because I think Dick did the weekday one.
Right. All right. So that's the 90s. And so then we hit the 2000s.
And cartoons die.
When cartoons die and then are reborn like a great fiery phoenix. like the ship from Gatchaman or Battle of the Planets. It's reborn because cartoons kind of die around the early 2000s, I would say. And then for whatever reason, Cartoon Network gets it into its head to basically start pumping lots of money into new shows. In a lot of ways, the 2000s, you could say, is the era where network television gave up, and literally did, because Saturday morning ceases to exist. The networks basically all they shift to live action programming for their Saturday mornings and eventually just give up entirely, I think.
Yeah, more or less.
More or less. Fox is still doing their thing, but all the other networks basically are like, yeah, forget this. And even Fox shifts from... they became the Fox Box because they actually changed the company. Because before it was Saban that was providing their material, and then it became... I'm blanking on the name of the company. But basically, that's why Fox's lineup completely changes. Because they actually have a different company basically running their Saturday morning at that point.
Yeah, it goes through a couple, because it's Saban, and then there's like an Italian company. There's
an Italian company? Oh, okay.
That does a bunch of that weird CGI stuff they pick up.
Right, okay. But the end result is that Fox is the only Saturday morning player really left in town pretty much at this point.
Well, they're gone now.
And then they're gone now. Oh, yeah. They disappeared. At this point in time, meaning the 2000s. And so they go, they made their attempts. Meanwhile, the cable networks, like Cartoon Networks, sensing opportunity because God knows everyone else is, not doing anything, suddenly decide to sink lots of money into doing original productions.
Yep.
And as an end result, in the mid to late 2000s, you actually get a real almost renaissance of cartoon animation because Cartoon Network, Disney, and who else? Nickelodeon, a bunch of companies are actually start really producing good stuff. So this is the era where we get like Avatar, The Last Airbender, not the movie, the TV show. This is the era where we get the new Justice League series. Justice League Unlimited is coming out at this time. But it's going to come for Cartoon Network though, so it actually has more. It has more freedom to do what they want. So they actually do. They do some different. You might not like it, but it actually was a pretty important show at the time. What else? They did a He-Man remake with beautiful animation. They did a Thundercats remake, beautiful animation.
Well, they did another He-Man remake. Yes, there was one in the 80s that nobody cared about.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, early 90s, I thought it was.
It's late 80s, early 90s.
Okay, we'll go with that, yeah.
Which. Yeah.
What else did they do during this time? They also do a G.I. Joe remake. They do...
2. Wasn't there...
Yeah, there's more than one. There's more than one.
Yeah.
There's one done since then. Anyway, but the key point is that, yeah, there's a ton of money is just dumped into doing TV animation at this point in the mid to late 2000s.
Yep.
And most of it's superhero, but not all of it. And
well, there's different, because what ends up happening, part of that renaissance is flash animation.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that it becomes cheap again.
Yeah.
Yep.
I guess it's probably because have to understand that in my case, most of the flash animation stuff, like Adventure Time, for example, which became super popular. There's another show that became super ultra popular, Adventure Time, and that's from that period. Is not really to my taste. Like style-wise, that's not my type of story. So that's why I didn't take an interest in it. But I think you did, right?
Oh, yeah, because my all-time favorite cartoon, like Saturday morning cartoon, is Thunder the Barbarian.
Oh, yes. Yep, from the 70s. Yep.
And Adventure Time is what would happen if Thunder the Barbarian had been written by 5-year-olds.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah, if you've seen both, you're like, oh my god, that is totally what's going on.
Okay, that's kind of.
So,
it's a very kid-focused, friendly version of Adventure. Okay, yeah, sure, Thunder. Okay, sure. I can see that. So there we go. So there's a big renaissance that happens during the 2000s, which kind of sort of peters out once we get into the teens. I've noticed that, well, at least let me put it this way. Cartoon Network basically began phasing their stuff out, I think around I want to say it's between 2012 and 2014. Basically, Cartoon Network basically phased out pretty much all of their action stuff, all of the stuff that was more oriented towards boys, basically, for one reason and for an older audience. I suspect, and I can be corrected on this, it's probably because they decided they were getting more bang for their buck out of the cheaper Flash stuff. And the more action-oriented stuff, like, say, Young Justice, which was a huge hit from 2012 to 2014. Again, the toys didn't sell, so the show ended up not getting renewed. But Young Justice it was basically one of their very last Cartoon Network action shows. It was not cheap. It was actually very expensive. It was well done. It got great ratings, but not to the target audience, and it didn't sell toys, so ultimately off it went.
Yeah, it was no Megas XLR, but okay, what is?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, that's true. Oh, yeah. Also from that period of the 2000s, we've also got Samurai Jack. Although that might have been early 2000s, actually. I think was Samurai Jack. That was early. And then there's Symbionic Titan. But my point again is that Cartoon Network was leading the pack for a while. But unfortunately, they eventually, I suspect change of management probably, just basically dumped most of their boys' action-oriented stuff. They let it peter out basically around 2014 or so.
Yeah, there's that, and I think what's happening is the same thing that started happening in the 80s. Because the 2000s were the 80s again.
Right.
Was that idea of they wanted to maximize profit. And it was that idea that you're doing a show to be a show and tacking on merch after.
That's true.
And a lot of stuff that wasn't working, so they wanted either something that's super cheap or something that already has pre-existing like merch.
That's true. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's sad to say, but stuff like Adventure Time, well, maybe not sad from your point of view, but stuff like Adventure Time really does sell merchandise. Like those cute stylized characters, in a lot of ways, is better for merchandise than more action-oriented characters are.
Well, yeah, no. I mean, it's I think, again, the 80s problem. Because like we've talked about with any kind of entertainment, it's cyclical.
Right.
That little kids like it. Little kids get older and you get like slightly older versions. If it really takes off, when those kids become adults, you get an adult version of it.
Right.
and then a new derivation for the next wave of kids.
Right.
And what's happening is we're getting to that point where a lot of this stuff, not just the comedy stuff, is hitting that older audience.
Right.
But they never make that jump into making it a fixture at that level because they either won't or can't take that chance to make it more serious and grown up, or they go the other route where it's like, okay, throwing like boobs, swearing, and blood everywhere.
That's true.
And then that's why we never quite get there. And it's just cheaper to do another batch of like the kiddie stuff. It's cheap. Kids don't know any better. They'll watch the same run cycle for 2 years, whatever.
Right. The other thing that happened during the 2000s, of course, was anime came in, and we kind of skipped over that. Technically started in the 90s. But that's kind of a whole other show and a whole other plot line. That's one of the reasons why we didn't really mention anime. But anime kind of came, and that was also part of the impetus, I think, for all the American action stuff. They looked at anime and they said, "This anime stuff, we can do that too." And I think that's where some of that came from as well during the 2000s.
Well, there's another catch with that too, though.
Oh,
that the Japanese stuff benefited from is that you had home video.
That's true.
So you would have, like, that was what saved Family Guy. Was that when they released it on DVD, it sold like crazy.
Right.
And then they realized we can make money selling the discs.
Yeah.
And that's where the home thing kind of... I think one of the things you're starting to see with that is because you've got places like Netflix and Crave and that you're seeing the equivalent of the home video boom of the 80s.
Right.
Where these stations are doing all kinds of like neat shows and that because they're still experimenting.
Right.
They need as much filler as possible, but that means they're doing things that are different, which is what happened in the 80s.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. Well, it's a cycle, right? Anytime a new technology comes around, there's an experimental phase.
Yeah.
And during that time, usually a lot of cool and interesting stuff ends up being done. And then eventually they perfect the formula and everything turns into bland crap.
Marvel Sunbow.
Exactly. Exactly. And you mentioned Netflix, and right now that's kind of where things are. I mean, the new Voltron remake by the makers of the Adventures of Korra, Legend of Korra and Avatar just came out. The new adventure, was it Voltron Legendary Defender, I think it's called, and which is extremely good. If people haven't watched it and you have Netflix, you really should check it out. But Netflix is doing a ton of animated stuff right now, and they're one of the few doing original animated stuff at this point. It's weird how it's just starting to shift from cable to these subscription services, internet. Yeah. That's who's doing animation now, and I've heard that's even happening in Japan too.
Yeah, because their stuff is super expensive.
Exactly.
But
and they've even been doing. There's actually series where they're actually doing deals with Netflix to produce anime now. Netflix is actually helping to pay for anime in Japan, and then they get to air it over here as well.
Yeah, and that mirrors a lot of what happened when you get to the 90s, when you mentioned Cartoon Network, that you had cable stations that were at the forefront of cartoons, and they died off on the regular networks because the networks couldn't sink the money into it. These guys were doing stuff that was new and exciting, and that's where all the attention moved.
Plus, they had the money, right? If you're a cable network, you actually have more money to play with. In theory, it depends who your backers are and how many subscribers you have.
Yeah.
But in Netflix's case, we already know that Netflix has actually got more subscribers than most of the cable networks. Or at least than HBO anyway. So and they got the money's just coming in directly. So they have money and they're looking for content. And so it's in their best interest, because there's actually, you don't have Netflix, I know, Don, but there's actually a Netflix Kids. Like, when you go into Netflix, you can go to the kids section or you can go to the general section, which has the kids stuff too. But so they've purposely been cultivating a whole huge kids section there. My nieces and nephew, they know how to turn on Netflix. In fact, they don't watch regular TV cartoons at all. They watch all their kids shows on Netflix.
Kid can't write his name, but he knows how to log into Netflix.
They do. That's not an exaggeration. They know that they're not allowed, and their parents feel safe because everything's G-rated basically in that kids section. So the kids are just allowed to log into the kids Netflix wing and go nuts, watch whatever you want.
Wow.
And so to them, that's TV. That's
Right.
normal. And I think that's comes around nicely. There's our future, right? They're a whole generation that's grown up with on-demand TV. When they watch what they want, when they want, as much as they want of it.
Right.
And I think that's the pattern for the future for television in general, and for it's what they're used to. So that's what they'll expect from the future as well.
Well, until the companies figure a way to stomp on it, because having variety means, oh my God, we have to spend money to make all kinds of stuff.
Well, yes and no, but actually it goes the other way too. Everything old is new again. See, all that old content, like that we're talking about, now I don't think Netflix has, like, say, Goober and the Ghost Chasers. But I've never looked, but I'm pretty sure they don't. But someday there will be services online where you'll be able to go and watch that if you want. Like everything that's ever been produced that's still... that's been digitized will be available on online streaming services for a small fee or for a subscription. That's just going to happen. It's already happening.
Well, you're seeing that too, because you mentioned Goober and the Ghost Chasers. I believe Turner Classic Movies has that on disc.
That doesn't surprise me, which means they digitized it, which means someday Turner Classic Movies subscription service will have, it'll be one of your options. We'll be able to watch that along with Crusader Rabbit.
Oh.
Although I don't think there's that much Crusader Rabbit left, actually. But I don't know. Maybe there is.
I don't know. When they started rerunning the old Rocket Robin Hoods here, they're digital copies. Somebody restored Rocket Robin Hood.
Oh, my God. Oh, we didn't touch on Rocket Robin Hood. I suppose that'll be a whole other show on Canadian animation. But,
don't touch Rocket Robin Hood.
Yeah, nobody touches Rocket Robin Hood if they can avoid it. In fact, I wonder how many of our listeners... There's a challenge. So, listeners, I haven't mentioned it on air before, but we actually have a Facebook group. So, if you're a fan of the show and you also happen to be on Facebook, come find the operatives of the Department of Nerdly Affairs Facebook group and join up. And we can actually talk and interact and such. And if you remember Rocket Robin Hood, come on to this episode's posting on the group and let us know. Because I'm curious to know how many people actually remember Rocket Robin Hood that aren't Canadian. Okay, Canadians can come on too. But I'm curious to know if it was actually shown other places besides Canada. Because it was shown to death for us, but it's because it's Canadian content.
Yeah.
All right, so I think since we've now covered past, present, and future, it's a very light overview. I'm sure that we missed all of your favorite shows. We never got to talk about Wait Till Your Father Gets Home, which, by the way, was basically Family Guy with less laughs, and aired during the 70s. It literally was Family Guy. Just Family Guy's a super messed up version of it. Anyway, but who knows, maybe we'll come back to some of this stuff, but this is our overview show of TV animation. We will definitely touch on this subject again sometime in the future. Maybe we'll actually have actual experts on at some point in the future who are actually around during that era. Anything's possible. So any final thoughts, Don, before we go?
Yeah, but I think each one of them would probably be like an episode unto itself.
Okay, well then we'll definitely retouch on the subject again because I don't want to go too much longer. All right, so on that note, thanks for listening, everyone. And please tune in again next time for something that's not the Star Wars Holiday Special and is going to be a great topic. You're absolutely going to love it, and you'll find out what it is when we do.
The Holiday Special does have an animated bit, though.
Still doesn't count. Good night, folks. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.